send tribute for the late former Prime Minister of Barbados, Professor the Right Honorable Owen Seymour Arthur. Up next on CaribNation. Hello, welcome to CaribNation. I'm Doris Dean. Former Prime Minister, Professor the Right Honorable Owen Seymour Arthur, the longest-serving Prime Minister of Barbados, died at the age of 70 after a very short illness. Prime Minister Arthur's stellar, tireless, and unselfish contributions to the economy of Barbados, to Caribbean regionalism, and in the international financial arena are well documented and will shape his enduring legacy. Joining me today to share memories of their experiences with the former Prime Minister, to pay tribute, and to talk about his legacy are His Excellency Noel Lynch, Ambassador of Barbados to the United States and Permanent Representative to the Organization of American States, Sir David Simmons, former Chief Justice of Barbados, Professor Andy Knight, Acting Chair, Department of Political Science, University of Alberta in Canada, and Professor David Hines, Associate Professor of Caribbean Studies, Arizona State University. Gentlemen, welcome to CaribNation, and thank you so much for joining me. And first, I will ask you to tell me about your relationship with Prime Minister Arthur and your reaction on hearing of his death. And I'll start with you, Professor Knight.
So he was not necessarily your typical politician in Barbados. You know, most politicians, forgive me for saying this, Dr. David, but Sir David, but most politicians tended to be from law, and here was a politician who was steeped in economics, who understood how the economy worked, how the global economy worked. I think that made him a little different from some of the other political leaders in the region, many of whom had focused primarily on law, and it gave him a unique perspective on governance. I think he's did a great service in terms of his knowledge of the economy and dismantling price controls and reforming state monopolies in Barbados, and also creating a virtual marketplace for the establishment of Fair Trading Commission, his work in telecommunications reform, which I think was ahead of his time in some ways, and the creation of a new competition policy in the region. All of this, I think, is linked directly to his ability to advance small market states, small island developing states on the global level.
To understand Owen Arthur in his both his particular but his general existence, one has to situate him within the context of the emergence of what we call globalization. What Professor Rex Nettleford said was only a new designation for an old obscenity. One has to understand Owen Arthur within the context of the rise of structural adjustment and globalization, and that Caribbean leaders were called upon to respond to that. All the leaders, the immediate colonial leaders, had to respond to a Caribbean within the context of the Cold War. And so to understand them, you have to begin there. To understand Arthur, you have to understand the challenges of the Caribbean within the context of the post-Cold War era, or what we call the globalization. And the fact that he was steeped in social sciences in general and economics in particular made him very relevant. And so in a sense, he was a product of a particular moment in Caribbean history. And he had the capacity to deal with that moment. And so that's how I would like to see Owen Arthur. And to do so, you had to do so both at the national level, but also within the context of the larger and wider Caribbean. It is instructive that Owen Arthur spent his early years in Jamaica under Michael Manley and the democratic socialist experiment. And you can see as he's grappling with the challenges of Barbados that he would have learned both the lessons of what happened in the Caribbean in that period, and so therefore was able to avoid some of the mistakes that was made there. How do you maintain a state and an economy that responds to the needs of the ordinary people, the least among us, while understanding the vulnerability of small states? As David Rudder said, in a world don't need islands no more. C.L.R. James once said about Garfield Sobers and the Mighty Sparrow that they represent a fusion of time, place, and person. And I would like to say that about Owen Arthur, that Owen Arthur represented that time, place, and person. And perhaps the reason that the Caribbean did not recognize, and perhaps today still doesn't recognize his singular importance, is that he is he's part of a region, a small region, that has really produced so many giants, right? Whether in the era of sports or academics or leadership or culture. And so therefore one has to search a little bit to find Owen Arthur, but he's there. When many of my generation expected in the post-Cold War era that a Kenny Anthony or Ralph Gonzalez, with all due respect to them, that they were going to lead this new renaissance in the Caribbean. Out came this almost obscure person who we would later find out is from the countryside in Barbados, who in effect would stamp his authority on that era. We ought to give thanks if there were not an Owen Arthur, there would be no big strides in the Caribbean single market and economy. That today, labor can move, well, categories of labor can move from one place to the other unhindered. That Owen Arthur himself ought to be credited with moving the Caribbean further down that road. And he did so without flair. He did so without what we may call the charisma. Remember, we in the Caribbean are accustomed to the charismatic leader who, when he or she speaks, brings people almost like in a godlike fashion. Owen Arthur did not possess that traditional charisma, but what he did is that he introduced a new kind of charisma into the Caribbean, a quiet efficiency, a commitment to the poor and the powerless, and an understanding that Barbados is not an island in a real sense, but is part of something wider than itself. And I really do think to understand Owen Arthur, we have to place him within that large and wider context.
Thank you, David. Ambassador Lynch, in the party, Prime Minister Owen Arthur was a mentor and a leader to any people, and I think our current Prime Minister, the Honorable Mia Amora Motley, will tell you that she has learned a lot from him and owes a lot to him. Talk a little bit about his role in the political arena as a mentor, as a guide for young people coming up, and what his philosophy was for them.
As a leader and as a mentor, Owen Arthur always looked out for young people. He was a fierce and supportive champion of regional integration in the region, obviously, but he championed the development of young people. And he spent much of his political career spurring on, encouraging them to the highest level of achievement. Owen believed, for example, and I don't know if he ever shared this with a lot of people, but Owen Arthur believed strongly in women's rights and women's leadership in an equally ferocious manner as he did on the concepts of regional integration. And he believed that women's rights were human rights. And his ability to identify female leadership, I mean, if you ever saw him with Billy Miller and with me and Motley, you could tell that Owen understood why a group that would have been suppressed in the past needed an opportunity to move forward now. So he mentored young people and he encouraged female leadership. And I believe that he did all in his power to promote female leadership. And that may be one of the reasons why Barbados is today enjoying the enlightened, successful leadership of its first female prime minister. I honestly think that if you met Owen anywhere, you would never have thought, as Sir David has said, that Owen Arthur was the prime minister of Barbados, because he was as comfortable in the corner shop as he was in the corridors of Parliament or in the cabinet. But Owen Arthur championed people, encouraged people to read, encouraged people to be prepared at all times. He was a man who understood that this was not about this was not about us small Barbados, 166 square miles. I believe as a development economist, Owen understood that he had this vision, and he was the architect of the Caribbean single economy, because he fiercely defended this principle as one way to fuel the economic development of CARICOM states. And this was a one way to move away from the dependence on large states to the interdependence of small states, expanding and creating markets, closing gaps that only understand the understanding of the shared culture that we have all lived, and novel partnerships can produce. So Owen always encouraged all of us to not think of Barbados. Don't think of the 166 square miles. Clarity of thought, sense of purpose, expected outcomes. That was his mantra. He talked about this all of the time. You know, what were you doing? What were you intending to do that would put us in a better place as it related to the progress of our people? And I believe one other thing, I think spending the time that he did in Jamaica, and I agree 100% with Professor Hines on this. I think spending his time in Jamaica, not only just under Michael Manley and under the Michael Manley administration, but dealing with the ordinary people in Jamaica. Omar Davies describes Owen Arthur as a Jamaican who happened just to be born in Barbados. He said that Omar Davies, the former Minister of Finance of Jamaica, he said Owen was a Jamaican who just happened to be born in Barbados, because he believed that Owen Arthur defended cultural elements that made us understand, that created the patriotism that Jamaicans live, was what he talked about all the time. Anytime I was in his presence, he talked about his experiences in Jamaica and the platform that it left for him to understand not only just integration, but how small countries could develop, came out of his Jamaica experience. And he always told us, all of us, all about that. And I believe that, he even speaking just recently about the Jamaica IMF program. You know, Jamaica has been celebrated and touted as a country that has done very, very well in an IMF program. When Arthur was saying that, that he was still concerned about elements of the program not lifting as many people out of poverty as he believed that it should have. You know, that was the kind of thing that Owen Arthur talked about. Owen Arthur wasn't interested in what you talked about, how much it meant to the middle class, but he wanted you to dig deeper and look deeper. And he believed a lot, finally, in being humble. He encouraged us to be humble. He often quoted from Thomas Gray's Elegy in a Country Churchyard, which was a memorial honoring the life of humble rustic folk, of which Owen Arthur thought that he was one. And it reminded us, as Sir David has said, that the same people that cheer you will jeer you in the future, and that you needed to stay humble. You need to stay humble. If you were going to be an elected politician, that you needed to stay humble, because the same people that were going to push you up are the ones that were going to eventually pull you down. Thank you.
I make one comment there. When he lost the last election, the last time, the comments I heard were that he had become too big and he was too sure of himself and he was beginning to take Barbados for granted. Does any one of you feel that that was a fair assessment?
I think that in 2013, there were, well, first of all, in 2008, there were factors at work which happened to eventuate after a person has been in power for a long time. After 14 years at the helm of politics in Barbados, people naturally tend to get tired of seeing the same old faces again in the BLP. So there is a call for a renewal, not necessarily of the same party, but new faces. And there is also another phenomenon to which people pay no attention. And that is that every so many years, 10 years certainly, there is a person coming on to the electoral register to vote for the first time. And he doesn't want to know at age 18 what you did 10 years ago and how you took the economy in 1994 when it was run down and built it at the foreign reserves at 2 billion and all the 30,000 jobs and so on. This first time voter, these young people want to know, what are you going to do for me now? And so the young people very often play a pivotal role in changing a government. And I think that those two phenomena operated in 2008, and more than likely by having lost again, he made himself vulnerable. And he was promoting the virtues of privatization in 2013. And I don't believe that the public of Barbados sufficiently understood what was involved in privatization so that it was easy for the Democratic Labour Party to distort his views on privatization and have all kinds of slogans and whatever. That resonated with the people. But he had his two defeats, and I thought that that was time for him to get out of politics and do his writings and lecturing at university and so on.
Make a contribution there. We're going to wrap up at this point. I'm going to ask Professor Knight to expand a little bit more on how you think Minister Arthur's legacy, what the picture looks like.
That's an important subject, because I think we don't do enough in terms of remembering the legacies of great leaders in the Caribbean region. And I think this is a time that we do something about this. My sense is that he's going to be remembered not just simply as a great Barbadian, which he was. Jamaicans obviously want to claim him as their own as well. He was a great Jamaican in that sense, but he was a true Caribbean man. And I think his living in Jamaica, he was married first in Jamaica, his living in Barbados, his understanding of how the Caribbean as a region individual islands cannot survive on their own. They have to survive in collaboration with each other in the region. His understanding of that, I think, and his understanding of regional integration will be one of the things that will be part of his legacy. I think more recent part of his legacy is going to be the way in which he vociferously supported Guyanese, the will of the people in Guyana in the last election. You recall that there was an election on March the 2nd, and it took over 100 days before finally President Granger stepped down and allowed the winner of the election to thrive. I think Arthur demonstrated his commitment to democracy and good governance in the region by focusing attention on what was going on there in Guyana and not allowing fraud to take place at this particular time in history. That reflected badly not just on Guyana, but on the rest of the Caribbean region as well. So his vociferous attempts at the head of the Commonwealth election monitoring team to protect the will of the people of Guyana, to protect the election results against possible fraud, I think is one of the legacies that will be, I think, remembered for a very long time. I know Guyanese will remember him for that for a very long time. His attempts to save Liat, which I'm sure Ambassador Lynch can talk more about. His attempts to save Liat, his understanding that you need to have a regional transportation mechanism in order to be able to preserve the integration of the region, I think is another legacy that will be definitely looked at. He wasn't successful in saving Liat, but I think his attempts to save Liat is important. And I think his final legacy that I would like to see preserved is his commitment to mentoring younger people. And I know this from the way he mentored me as an individual, from a distance sometimes, but me as an individual. I have a great story about my nephew, who is now an Olympic diver. And when he was like 9 or 10 years old, he was having to make a decision about which country he's going to dive for. And my sister was Barbadian, of course, wanted him to dive for Barbados. Her husband, who's Jamaican, wanted him to dive for Jamaica. And I still have this picture right now of Owen and young Yona Night Wisdom, who is the diver, on the beach in Barbados having a chat about this. And I think Owen respected Yona's decision to dive for Jamaica because he himself knew that the Caribbean is all one, and of course Yona's decision was based on the fact that he wanted to be on the same team as Usain Bolt. So I mean, how can you argue with that one, right? So so he understood why he wanted to do that, but it just shows the nature of the man. He was not just simply a great Barbadian individual. He was also a great Caribbean individual. I like to see his legacy sort of be remembered around that theme of being a leader for the region, not just simply Barbados. So I leave it there.
Thank you. As a Guyanese, Professor David Hines, I will ask you, do you want to comment on Professor Knight's analysis of Owen Arthur's role in the Guyanese elections?
Well, obviously, I don't share Professor Knight's sentiments on the role played there, but history will deal with that in the years to come. But I would like to remember Owen Arthur, of course, as I said, as a regionalist. But I think in terms of Barbados, Owen Arthur remembered as the leader that extended the life of welfare state as far as it could go. Now, I always like to say that the rest of the Caribbean tried with a little socialism here and all that kind of stuff. But and the objective always was to show that the state plays a role in terms of lifting the working people and lifting the society, what we call the welfare state. But Barbados has always quietly kept that welfare state going when he died in other regions of the Caribbean without much ideological flair. And I think Owen Arthur extended that welfare state as far as it could go. And this is coming not from a left-wing ideologue. So there must be something about him and his perspective of the world that was unique, that he could do that. And I think Barbadians, of course, would some time to recognize that moment in history, as Sir David said, that perhaps for all his genius, he made some mistakes, and that mistakes was not recognizing that by 2008, a new generation was coming into being. And that political person, you needed to replenish your stocks. One ought not to define and understand an icon by his acts of omissions or his misstep, but to recognize him or her for their fundamental contributions at a moment when the country, the region were in crisis, and they stepped up and they were able to pull the region and pull their country out of that crisis and to leave something for the next generation of leaders to move on. And I think Owen Arthur played that role, coming out of the Cold War and facing this global avalanche that we're calling globalization. And it's the way in which it suppressed small countries and the poor people. It meant that some generation, some cadre of leaders had to step forward to take control. And I think Owen Arthur did that in a most sterling way, and he must be remembered for that contribution.
Thank you. Sir David.
Owen Arthur was a legend in his lifetime. His massive, and what you said at the very beginning, stellar contribution to the development of Barbados and its peoples, and his commitment to regional integration have combined to guarantee him an indelible place in the history of the islands of the Commonwealth Caribbean.
Thank you. And Ambassador Lynch, I'll ask you to wrap up.
Well, Darius, let me just say this. Obviously, like most of the other participants, he'll be remembered as a great Caribbean man, and his contribution, the contribution that he made to the Caribbean, and particularly even globally, in terms of positioning small states and making small people's voices heard, small states' voices heard, and emboldening small people to understand that the world was their oyster and that you could achieve, that size didn't determine your depth and breadth of achievement. That is true. In my opinion, Owen Arthur ably and admirably executed his duty to Barbados and to the region. And may he rest in peace. Thank you.
Thank you. That is a perfect point on which to end. And I thank you all. Prime Minister, Professor, the Right Honorable Owen Seymour Arthur, son of Barbadian soil, a man of the Caribbean. Until next time, I'm Darius Dean, and remember, our motto is one people, one culture, one Caribbean, one nation.